The morning my daughter-in-law packed her bag and said she'd be gone for a week, I remember thinking, finally, some quiet. I feel guilty about that now. Not because I was wrong about wanting the quiet, but because of what happened the moment her car disappeared around the corner. My son, who hadn't taken a single unassisted step in 6 years, walked out of his bedroom, stood in the hallway, and looked at me with eyes I hadn't seen since before the accident. Clear, focused, decided. "Dad," he said, "we need to talk, and then we need to drive somewhere." I set down my coffee mug so hard it cracked the saucer. I should back up, because none of this makes sense without context, and I've learned that the full story is the only one worth telling. My name is not important. What matters is that I'm 64 years old. I live in a 4-bedroom house in Bozeman, Montana, that I built most of with my own hands, and until about 8 months ago, I believed I was a decent judge of character. I spent 31 years as a structural engineer. I read blueprints for a living. I can look at a load-bearing wall and tell you within minutes if something is off, if the weight is distributed wrong, if there's hidden stress the surface doesn't show. Turns out, I was completely blind when it came to the woman my son married. My son, I'll call him by what I've always called him, which is just son, because that's what he is to me before anything else, was 31 when the accident happened. He'd been working as a wildland firefighter out of Missoula, the kind of job that made his mother nervous every single season. She passed 3 years before the accident, breast cancer, and sometimes I think the only mercy in her death was that she didn't have to watch what happened to him. He was on a crew doing controlled burns in the Bitterroot when a wind shift came out of nowhere. He didn't make it out clean. A falling snag caught him across the lower back, compressed 2 vertebrae, and by the time they got him to St. Patrick's, the doctors were using phrases like incomplete spinal injury and uncertain prognosis and realistic expectations. He was alive. He could feel his legs. He just couldn't make them do what he told them to. The first year was hospitals, then a rehab facility in Billings, then home with me. He was in a wheelchair, doing physical therapy 3 times a week, and I want you to understand, he was not defeated. That was never his character. He was quieter than before, yes, more watchful. But the fire in him didn't go out. I see that now. At the time, I just thought he was coping. His wife, I'll call her what she was to me then, which is my daughter-in-law, though I've since had to scrub that phrase clean of any warmth. She appeared in his life about 14 months after the accident. She was a licensed occupational therapist who'd done contract work at the same rehab facility in Billings. She was 34, smart, polished, the kind of woman who knows how to be exactly what a room needs her to be. She was attentive to my son in ways that seemed, at the time, like love. She modified exercises for him. She researched adaptive equipment. She drove 2 hours from Billings to see him on weekends. My son, who had spent over a year being poked and measured and managed by medical professionals, was suddenly being seen by someone as a person. Or so it looked. They married 18 months after they met. I stood next to my son at the ceremony. He was in the wheelchair. She'd offered to have the whole venue rearranged so he could stand at the altar with a support frame, but he declined, said it wasn't about how he looked, and I thought, this woman is good for him. I thought, she understands what she's getting into and she's choosing it. I was wrong on every count that mattered. They moved into the house with me. That part was my idea. The house is big enough, the layout works for a wheelchair, and my son needed consistency in his therapy. I converted the main floor bedroom into their space, put in a roll-in shower, widened the hallway to the back porch. It wasn't charity. I wanted them there. I liked the company. The house had been too quiet since my wife passed. For the first year, things seemed fine. My daughter-in-law kept up her therapy work remotely, consulting for a clinic in Helena. She managed my son's PT schedule, his medications, his follow-up appointments. She handled the paperwork I'd always found exhausting. Insurance claims, disability filings, the quarterly reviews for his long-term care policy. Looking back, I should have asked more questions about that paperwork. I'm a man who trusts people until I have a reason not to. That's not naivety, or I didn't think it was. I come from a generation where you extend good faith and people generally honor it. My son's medical situation was complicated, the documentation was thick, and my daughter-in-law had credentials and expertise and apparent devotion. When she put papers in front of me to sign, I signed them. When she explained that certain accounts needed to be restructured for tax purposes, I restructured them. When she suggested that consolidating the disability income into a joint management account would simplify things, I agreed. She did all of this slowly, over nearly 3 years. Not one big ask, but 100 small ones, each reasonable in isolation, each building on the last. I'm not going to list every piece of it here, because I'm still angry about how clean it was. But by the time my son stood in that hallway and looked at me with those clear eyes, she had maneuvered herself into control of 3 accounts, including the proceeds from a settlement my son received from the State Firefighters Compensation Fund, which totaled just over $240,000. I didn't know she'd moved most of it. My son did. He told me everything that morning. We sat at the kitchen table, him in his chair, me in mine, and he talked for almost 2 hours without stopping. He was calm in the way that people are calm when they've had a long time to prepare for a difficult conversation. He'd been recovering for almost 2 years. Not fully. He was careful to explain that. The nerve damage was real, the injury was real, and he would likely never have the same range of motion and endurance he had before. But he'd been doing private physical therapy, sessions arranged through a former colleague at the Missoula Rehab Center, someone he trusted, someone he paid for in cash, out of an account my daughter-in-law didn't know existed. For 22 months, he could walk. Not fast, not far without pain, but he could walk. He'd hidden it from her deliberately. I started suspecting something was wrong about 6 months into the marriage, he said. He was looking at his coffee, turning the mug in his hands. Little things first. She'd make comments about your assets, not in a greedy way, just curious in a specific direction. She asked about your retirement accounts once, said she was just thinking about estate planning. I said I didn't know the details and I'd ask you, and she said, "Don't bother, she'd look into it." He paused. She forgot she'd said that, he continued. A week later she brought it up again like it was a new idea. The more he watched, the more he noticed. She was meticulous about their finances in a way that felt less like care and more like management. She kept physical files locked in a cabinet in their room. She used a separate laptop for certain tasks. She'd take calls in the car, and when he asked who she was talking to, she'd say insurance or the clinic. But the conversations didn't sound like that. He started keeping notes, dates, observations, anything that felt off. He didn't confront her. He told me he knew that would just make her defensive and more careful. Instead, he called his former colleague, a man he'd done training with before the accident, who happened to be married to a forensic accountant. One consultation led to another. By the time my daughter-in-law drove out of our driveway that morning with her overnight bag, my son had 26 months of documented observations, 3 separate professional assessments of the financial irregularities, and a meeting scheduled with a financial crimes attorney in Missoula for the following afternoon. He'd waited for her to leave because he didn't want a scene. He'd waited for the right moment because he knew that rushing it would cost us. "Dad," he said at the end of that 2-hour conversation, "I need you to not be angry right now. I need you to just come with me." I wasn't angry. I was something past angry, on the other side of it, somewhere quieter and colder. I told him I'd get my jacket. He stood up from his wheelchair, crossed the kitchen on his own 2 feet, and handed me my keys off the hook by the door. I stood there holding those keys, and I didn't say anything for a long moment. "I know," he said. "We'll talk more in the car." The drive to Missoula is about an hour and a half from our place. We talked the whole way. He filled in everything I'd missed, not accusingly, not with any suggestion that I'd been foolish, just factually, the way he'd always communicated when something was serious. He got that from his mother. She used to say that the most respectful thing you can do for someone you love is to not soften information that they need in full. I asked him why he hadn't told me sooner. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because you trusted her, and if I'd said something before I could prove it, you'd have been put in the middle of a conflict with no clear answer. I didn't want to do that to you." I thought about that for most of the remaining drive. The attorney, a woman named Vickers, late 40s, with an office that smelled like old coffee and had file boxes stacked halfway up one wall, had reviewed everything my son had brought her over the previous few weeks. She did not mince words. What my daughter-in-law had done constituted financial elder abuse under Montana law, exploitation of a vulnerable adult, and potentially wire fraud, given that some of the transfers had crossed state lines. The disability settlement funds, which were my son's legally, had been redirected in ways that were documented and traceable. She asked me if I wanted to proceed. I looked at my son. He looked at me. Yes, I said. The next 3 weeks were the strangest of my life. My daughter-in-law came back from her trip as if nothing had happened, and I had to pretend everything was normal. That was the hardest part. I've never been a man who could hide what he felt. My wife used to say my face was like a weather vane. You always knew which way the wind was blowing. But I did it. I kept my expressions neutral. I made coffee. I ate dinner at the same table as her. I said goodnight. My son was better at it than me. He'd been doing it for 2 years. Attorney Vickers had coordinated with the county sheriff's financial crimes unit. There were investigators involved, people I never met, but who had apparently been building a parallel picture of the accounts in question. At some point, through avenues my son didn't fully detail and I didn't need to know, it became clear that my daughter-in-law was not acting alone. There was a contact she'd maintained from before the marriage, someone in Billings with a history of similar schemes, who had been receiving transfers. She was moving money to him, and he was moving it further. I won't pretend I understood all the mechanics. What I understood was the shape of it. She had come into our home, into my son's life with a purpose. Maybe she'd had genuine feelings at some point. I don't know. It doesn't change what she did. She'd used his injury and my trust as a vehicle. The morning the investigators came to the house, my son and I were sitting on the back porch. It was early, cold, the way Montana mornings are even in late spring, and we had coffee and we were watching the light come up over the ridge. We'd been getting up early together for the past 2 weeks, just to have that time before the day started. I think we both needed it. My daughter-in-law came out to tell us there were people at the front door. She looked confused when they asked her to come with them. Then she looked at my son, and then she looked at me. And in that moment I saw it, not guilt exactly, but recognition. The understanding that she'd miscalculated, that something she'd believed was hidden had been seen. She didn't say anything to either of us. She went with them quietly. I watched the car pull out of the driveway and I thought about the morning she'd left for her trip, just a few weeks earlier, when I'd thought, finally, some quiet. It was quiet now, a different kind. The legal process took months. I won't walk through all of it because the details were numbing, and most of what I remember is sitting in waiting rooms and signing things. What I can tell you is that she pleaded guilty to 3 charges: financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, wire fraud, and theft, and received a sentence of 4 years with the possibility of parole after 30 months. Her associate in Billings was charged separately and received a longer sentence. The majority of the misappropriated funds were identified and a recovery process was initiated, though I was told to expect that some portion would remain unrecoverable. That turned out to be true, but most of it came back. My son moved out of the main floor bedroom and into a room upstairs. He said he needed to stop thinking of himself as someone who lived on the ground floor for reasons of necessity. He wanted to climb the stairs, so he did. Slowly, with effort, sometimes with a hand on the rail, and he started sleeping in the room that had been his when he was a teenager, where there were still faint pencil marks on the doorframe from when I used to measure his height every birthday. He found a therapist in town, not for his legs, for everything else. He told me that in a tone that expected me to make it weird, and I didn't, because why would I? His mother would have said the same thing. I started walking with him in the evenings, around the neighborhood at first, then longer routes as he built back up. He was 37 years old and rebuilding in ways most people never have to contemplate, and he did it with a deliberateness that I found honestly humbling. I'm 64, and I've been coasting on the momentum of a life that was mostly going the direction I aimed it. Watching my son decide, consciously and repeatedly, to take the next step, sometimes, literally, recalibrated something in me. There's something I've thought about a lot in the months since all of this resolved. It's about trust and what it costs and whether the cost is worth it. I trusted my daughter-in-law, and she used that trust to take from my son and from me. If I try to draw a lesson from that, don't trust people. Be more careful. Verify everything. It feels incomplete. Because the other thing that's true is that I trusted my son completely and without condition for his entire life. And he proved in the hardest possible way that the trust I placed in him was not only justified, but that it went further than I'd imagined. He protected me when I didn't know I needed protection. He was patient when I would have been reckless. He thought about consequences when he had every reason to just be angry. So where does that leave me on the question of trust? I think it leaves me here. Trust is not a strategy, it's a practice. You extend it, and sometimes you're wrong, and sometimes you're right in ways that exceed everything you hoped. You don't stop practicing it because you were wrong once. You just pay closer attention to what the evidence is actually telling you instead of what you want it to say. My son did that for 2 years while sitting in a wheelchair in my house. He paid attention, he documented, he waited. I think I owe him the same quality of attention for whatever comes next. It's been 8 months now. The house is different in ways I'm still cataloguing, quieter in some places, louder in others. My son has taken up cooking on weekends, real cooking, the kind that requires multiple burners and periodic consultation of 3 different cookbooks simultaneously. And on Sundays the kitchen is a controlled disaster that smells extraordinary. He's been in contact with the wildland fire community again. Not to go back, his doctors have been clear that his physical profile has changed permanently, and he's accepted that, but to consult on training protocols for injury prevention. He got on a video call last month with a crew out of Kalispell, and I could hear him through the wall, talking about load distribution and terrain variables and how to read a wind shift. His voice had a quality in it that I'd missed for 6 years. Competence, certainty, the sound of a person doing what they're built for. I knocked on the door when he was done and he called me in, and he was smiling in a way I hadn't seen since before his mother died. Not a performed smile, not a managing the situation smile, just the real one. We drove out to a spot near the Gallatin River. That evening, a pullout I used to take his mother to when we wanted to watch the light change on the mountains. We didn't say much. The water was high from snowmelt, loud enough that you had to raise your voice to be heard, so we mostly didn't bother. We just stood there, the 2 of us, while the sun moved behind the range and the sky went through its inventory of colors. At some point he put his hand on my shoulder, briefly the way men in our family do when words aren't the right tool. I put my hand over his. That was enough. That was more than enough. I'm 64 years old, and I've built things that will stand after I'm gone. Bridges, beams, load-bearing walls calculated to hold weight for 100 years. But standing at that river, watching my son breathe Montana air without the weight of deception pressing down on either of us, I thought, this is the thing I'll remember. Not the fraud, not the legal process, not the satisfying fact of accountability being served. This, my son standing on his own 2 feet, both of us finally genuinely free.